critical care at Edinburgh University. He's the past chairman of the UK Critical Care Research Network and has a wide range of interests, including sedation and the critically ill and recovery from critical illness, and is going to talk to us today about improving quality-adjusted life years. Are we kidding ourselves? Thanks, Tim.
Thanks very much. I hope for those of you who may have attended my previous talks, this will be a progression of some of the arguments I've put forward, but not too much of a repetition. So I added to this title, Reflections of a Tired Trialist, because, as I hope I'll show to you, this is what we're trying to do, particularly with our rehabilitation trials. We're trying to make life better, but we've really failed to do that in most of our trials anyway so far. I've got a few declarations, the same as the ones I've shown previously. They're not relevant to this talk, but I have an important point to make, which is I'm not a health economist. I'm going to talk a bit about health economic terms in which I'm not an expert. So please be kind on me with questions if you ask me one. So what is a quality-adjusted life year, or a QALY? It's supposed to be a measure of the state of health of a person over time. So it's not at a fixed time point. It assumes that health is represented by length of life and quality of life. So are you alive, yes or no? And if you're alive, can we measure and grade the quality you're reporting? And a QALY is equal to 1 year of life in perfect health. So that's what health economists have derived. If you have a QALY, it means you had 1 year of perfect health. So how do health economists calculate QALYs? Well, essentially what they try to do is collect data that allows you to create a number between 0 and 1 that represents how close you are to that 1 year of perfect life. So 0 means you were dead for a year. 1 means you had perfect life for a year. Now, the way that's done is you have to measure something. It's easy to measure death, but to measure quality of life, you have to use a tool to measure quality of life. And then when you get the score on that tool, you have to convert that score into a population estimate between 0 and 1 of quality. And that's done by creating a utility. And that's done by a technique called time trade-off, where surveys of the population against a quality of life measure are used to estimate at population level what a period of time with that score represents on this 0 to 1 scale. And it's more complex than that mathematically, but that's effectively what is done in calculating a QALY. So by definition, a QALY is a population level estimate. It's done for each individual, but it is based on assumptions about the population and their responses to a particular score on a quality of life questionnaire. And that may be one of the problems. It's not disease specific, and it's not specific to that individual at that time. It's an estimate. But clearly, it's quite an attractive estimate, because if you could demonstrate from an intervention, whether in a trial or a service improvement or whatever, that you had improved this, then you're likely to be able to get funding for it. And that is what drives, certainly in the UK, many of the decisions around funding new therapies or interventions. So QALYs are essentially the utility. In other words, were you dead or alive, and how did we grade your quality of life from 0 to 1 from that over time? The duration that we either measured or we extrapolated and estimated you spent over either a particular time, a year, 5 years, or a lifetime by extrapolation by a health economist. That's what generates the QALYs, and that's what the health economist does. So in quite simple terms, and I'm quite simple, if you imagine 2 patients here, the patient in blue is patient A. They died quicker than patient B, and during the time before they died, they basically, at those time points, they had a lower quality of life. So their QALY was less over a shorter time. Whereas the brown patient survived longer, and during that survival, the quality of life was measured as higher. So you can see the combination of the quality of life, survival, and the time it occurred is preferential for the brown patient. So if the intervention generated more brown patients, it's going to have generated a benefit measured this way. And if you know the cost that you incurred to generate that change, you can estimate the cost per QALY. And if the cost per QALY is above or below a certain threshold set by your funder, then you can start to make decisions about whether you're going to fund something at population level. So the advantages of QALYs are they're relatively simple and cheap to collect. They do combine death and quality of life in a single metric, which is a problem to us because lots of our patients die. That's really inconvenient in terms of when you're interested in quality of life, because you then have to somehow account for that. And it means also you can use population-level data for your population. So if a particular quality of life has been associated in the UK or Australia with a certain utility, you just extrapolate. That's one of the advantages, and it enables incremental cost-effectiveness to be estimated. But the disadvantages are that you assume that the health-related quality of life measure captures the patient preferences either for that patient or for the population of patients you're interested in. It's not disease or condition specific, it's a generic measure, and it doesn't capture the social domains, and it's not a disability measure. So it's focused on health, not other stuff. And in particular, health economists debate whether QALYs capture something they often call well-being. And the simplest way I'd think about well-being is happiness. Things like happiness. With the state of life I have, am I happy or am I miserable? Because I might have the same score, but be happy or miserable, or somewhere in between. And they're not the same thing. And they rely on trajectories. And the big challenge we have is we don't have a reliable pre-ICU measure because our patients can't tell us. And the best we can do is ask them to remember, or we can ask their relative to judge it. And there's quite a literature on that, and it's probably a reasonable thing to do, but it creates a lot of uncertainty. So this is the EuroQual EQ5D, which is the most widely recommended measure of quality of life, and hopefully you can see at least the domains there. It's a simple measure, and it has simple responses about mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain, discomfort, and anxiety and depression. And then you give a thermometer score between your worst and your best imaginable health. And those very simple responses are turned into a score which a health economist can look up for the population to generate a utility and add to death and get a 0 to 1 score. And that is one of now the recommended, from Dale Needham's work, outcome measures for critical care or acute respiratory failure. So if we want to improve QALYs, we can do it at absolute, we either can improve something at an absolute time point multiple times, either by survival or quality of life score, or we can try and maintain that for longer. And the two obviously link together. And in our country, or the country I work in, you really have to generate an improvement in one QALY over a population at a cost of less than about 20 to 30,000 pounds, so about, I guess, 35 to 40,000 Australian dollars, to basically be below the threshold that says, yeah, we're going to do this. And usually that's about drugs. So what do we know about QALYs in intensive care? So there are an increasing number of studies, and particularly in the UK, most of our large trials now are funded to have economic analyses within them. And if you read the papers, the large studies for the UK studies, they will virtually all have a quality of a health economic assessment that includes QALYs. It may not be in the main paper, but it'll be in the additional report in our funders journal. And obviously in other countries it's increasingly done. But Brian Cuthbertson, who's now in Canada but was previously in Scotland, he's one of the first people to work with health economists to measure QALYs. And what he estimated here was that the dashed line is the general population, QALYs over time, the cumulative QALYs you'd expect someone to get, so it's slightly less than 1 per year because nobody's really got perfect health and populations don't. But he used some quality of life data he measured in an ICU cohort in Aberdeen to estimate QALYs, and that's the non-dashed line. And he clearly showed that there's a much lower gaining of QALYs after being an ICU survivor than if you weren't. And I guess we know that, but he was the first person to sort of begin to look at it with health economists. So I'm now going to tell you about the trial we did. I alluded it to in some of my other talks, but I didn't tell you much about the details. I'm going to use the next few minutes to tell you what we did, because ultimately what we really wanted to do in our trial, our recovery trial, our rehab trial, which started with ICU survivors, was gain QALYs. That's what we were trying to do because we wanted to improve the outcome of our patients. So this was our RECOVER trial. It was published a few years ago. And the objective, our primary outcome, but our main objectives was to use a complex rehab package from the time of ICU discharge to up to 3 months later, wherever the patient was, to improve mobility, health-related quality of life, and a range of prevalent disabilities. But a key secondary objective was to evaluate the cost-effectiveness of this novel intervention approach, because it was about people doing things, and that's usually quite expensive. And we wanted to compare experiences, and I showed some of the experience data in my talk yesterday. And very briefly, we spent a lot of time trying to work out what we should do, and that was based on qualitative work, literature review, pilot work, because it was a complex intervention. But we provided information to patients about their illness and ICU survivorship in various ways. We provided physical therapy tailored to the individual in various ways. We provided dietetic input in various ways. We had various referral trigger tools that were agreed with different specialties like speech, language, occupational therapy. And the overall thing was about case management, providing continuity. And we did all that by employing an individual who did all those things for one of the groups of patients. And they were trained to do that. And we called them a generic rehabilitation assistant. And we were pretty hopeful that this was going to improve a patient's recovery and their quality of life, because it was all based on what patients had told us in the lead up to designing the interventions that they needed. And we had an intervention group which got all that, and that was 120 patients. And we had a usual care group which got usual rehabilitation in our hospital, which got some of that, but didn't get that coordinated approach, didn't get the information in particular, and got less nutritional and physical intervention. And I'm not going to show you that data, but they did get quite a lot less. And we did that for up to 3 months, but most of it occurred in hospital. Our primary outcome was a thing called the Believability Index, and we had a whole host of secondary outcomes, including quality of life, measured with the SF-12, which is an abbreviated version of the SF-36, and we had also a health economic analysis. And this was the Believability Index, because many people aren't familiar with it. It's one of the things that was criticized about our trial, but we did it because it was pragmatic, it was hierarchical, and we were pretty sure we'd get it in everyone, which we did. But it perhaps had a ceiling effect in our trial, which doesn't matter for what the points of today. But it was basically a 1 to 15 scale of what you could do, and it's highly validated in the stroke literature. And we did a trial, well, we thought. We did a highly internally valid study. We actually had very few deaths in our follow-up, which was good, because that's difficult to deal with. We followed most of the patients up for a year, and we had almost 100% follow-up at our primary outcome point. We were pleased with the way we did our trial. And the power was based on 240 patients, and we achieved that, and that was for clinically important differences in terms of minimum clinically important differences. And we recruited about 50% of the eligible patients. And these were the baseline characteristics. I showed you some of this yesterday. These were really impaired patients when they entered our trial. They were older, they were comorbid, many of them were malnourished. And they had been sick in ICU, they'd spent a week in ICU, most of them had had vasopressors, a quarter of them had had renal replacement therapy. So this was our primary outcome data, and I didn't show you this yesterday. And this was so depressing when we saw this, that our primary outcome at 3 months was no different, but when we looked at our outcome measure across the whole trajectory of recovery, it clearly wasn't modified by what we did. And then when we looked at our other outcomes, I'm not going to go through all of them individually, but I'm going to highlight that one. The quality of life measure at 3 months was typical to the observational cohort studies, with the physical component definitely impaired significantly, but absolutely no difference, and the confidence intervals excluded a clinically important difference with confidence. We didn't have an impact on this measure, and when we looked at all the other things that we're all interested in, we didn't affect any of those either. It was really depressing after all this work. So we went on to do a cost-effectiveness analysis, and perhaps this is where the relevance of what I've described to you comes into this talk, because this then gets into QALYs. So the health economists we work with calculated QALYs. So the first thing that may be interesting to you, and we're a pretty cheap healthcare system in the UK, but from the time of leaving ICU, so this doesn't include ICU stay, to 12 months, when we costed what each of our patients on average were costing, it was about £50,000, about $100,000 of largely secondary healthcare costs in hospital. So these are an expensive cohort of patients, but there was absolutely no difference between our groups. We didn't generate a saving in particular from our intervention. And when you look at the QALYs, you can see that these patients, as a population, do have a very impaired quality of life because they only had an average QALY of 0.5, which is pretty low. And given that very few of them died, so these are nearly all survivors with very low quality of life, which confirms what we saw in the quality of life scores, and there was no difference. But the costs in this cohort were very dominated by secondary care costs, and they were very dominated by what happened in hospital before the patients went home. But it actually only cost about £700, about, I guess, 1,400 Australian dollars per patient to provide this intervention, which is less than a day of ICU stay. So the cost-effectiveness analysis of our study based on QALYs was negative. But would it be worth investing an extra 1,000 Australian dollars a day, because that was basically the person when you averaged it out over all the patients, to achieve what happened in the trial? And at the moment, our funder would say no, because it didn't have incremental cost effectiveness. So this is what health economists do. In the top left, they produce these cost effectiveness planes. And in the bottom right is what the health economists came up with for our trial. And you may say, what the hell is that? But basically, that is a whole load of simulations based on the real data in the trial to try and work out exactly where the relationship between cost and effect was. And I don't know whether you can see it, but there's a tiny red dot in the middle, and that's where the average effect was. And it basically said, we didn't save any money, we cost a tiny bit more money, but we didn't have any effect on QALYs. And therefore, this is not a cost-effective intervention. That's what health economists do. And that's what virtually every ICU trial that's had health economic evaluation has shown as well. So we concluded, strictly speaking, because that's what you do, is that our intervention had no effect on any of these things, because it didn't. So why might QALYs, which seems like a really good idea, why may we not have gained any QALYs, which is what we were trying to do? So first of all, if we didn't save any lives, which is the easy way to gain QALYs, then that may have been against us. So I'm just moving away from our trial now to think about intensive care. So I showed this slide yesterday, which is a population-level study from Scotland that we did a few years ago. And just to highlight again that virtually all the death in our population occurs early, and that's the bottom line, especially compared to other hospitalised patients in the normal population, which was the top line. So virtually all of it happens there. But when you start looking at survivor populations, the separations are much smaller, but they are there. And there's about a 10 and 10 rule, we found, that there was a 10% higher real mortality when you adjusted for things than a hospitalised population that were otherwise similar. And there's about a 20% excess mortality compared to people who never went to hospital, who were similar in terms of age, demographic, social deprivation, and so on. But in fact, what we found was that the excess mortality in this population-level study was almost exclusively in younger people. And when we went on, and I alluded to this yesterday, to really try and understand what the drivers of this was, it was about pre-existing health, not really that much about ICU stay. So if we're trying to gain QALYs, we either have to save lives in the ICU bit or the hospital bit when all the deaths occur, but later on in rehabilitation trials, we're up against it because we're actually fighting comorbidities and things we might not be able to modify. So perhaps it's not surprising we can't gain a QALY. And we need to build this in and appreciate this. And maybe it's not worth following people up for a long time if you're trying to measure QALYs. Maybe you should just follow them up for 3 or 6 months, which would be a lot easier and cheaper. Because you really have to focus if it's mortality where you're trying to gain them in that initial period. And of course we know very few of our studies have saved lives, sadly. And when you go on statistically to look at those predictors of mortality, and I didn't show these data yesterday, but the bit in the middle where it says chi-squared, LRT chi-squared, the bigger that number, statistically, the more important that variable was in the long term for explaining excess mortality. Now, age is not surprising, because if you're older, you're more likely to die. But you'll see that the other major thing was comorbidities that I highlighted yesterday. Now, ICU admission diagnoses were important, but it's very restricted to certain types of diagnosis, like pancreatitis, like variceal bleeding, and we felt that that probably explained a lot of the excess mortality that was in the younger people, because they're the people who managed to survive and who go on to have long-term problems that were more directly related to the diagnosis they had in ICU, even if some of those were actually complications of chronic disease, like variceal bleeding. But although these things like social deprivation are important and stuff about ICU, the relative importance of these was really small, which is why the number's really small. And that was an important point. So it may be, certainly in our trial, but maybe in ICU trials, is we're not going to gain QALYs unless we affect mortality, and we know that's really hard, but maybe that should be the focus. So let's think about the health-related quality of life. So it may be that the modifiable element of the health-related quality of life bit is really limited, and I talked about this yesterday, so I'm not going to go over all the same things again, but this was one of the secondary analyses we did of our trial, which was done by David Griffith, and on the left-hand panel, those flat lines on the left are the physical and on the right the mental component of quality of life, and it was a flat line from 3 to 12 months, and I highlighted this yesterday, and the absolute changes were very small, even though for the physical component they were statistically significant. They weren't clinically very significant. But when we looked at where people were on the plateau, then it wasn't predicted by something we could have easily modified, in other words, comorbidity. And I didn't show this yesterday, but this is more detail about the regression analysis that we did. Just to highlight again that age is clearly important, because we all know if you're older, then it's much more difficult to regain quality of life. We can't turn back the years. But the comorbidity was really important. But here are the ICU-related variables that we chose, Apache score and the number of days on a ventilator, and these were unimportant. These were not influencing where you ended up on that plateau. So we would like to improve QALYs, but if we can't change mortality, or we don't think we're going to change mortality, and most of the quality of life is difficult to modify, QALY is not a good score for measuring the benefit of what we're doing. It may be we're having no benefit, but if there is a benefit, we're probably not going to measure it. So one of the things that may be relevant is what your pre-existing health was. So if you're previously really fit, maybe that's the group where we have benefit versus the comorbid. So what this slide showed was, and maybe focus on the left hand, which is the physical component score, is we broke patients down into comorbidity counts. And this is where you begin to see interesting signals. So the far left is patients who had no comorbidity, the young, fit, trauma, sepsis patient, that sort of patient. And there you see the overall physical component score at 3, 6, and 12 months, which are the 3 points, are higher because they're younger, and they go up. And they still plateau, but they go up close to 50, which is the population norm. But as you move towards the right of comorbidities, it's flat and it's lower. So not all these patients are the same. I won't focus on the mental component, which tends to have different patterns. And we're not the only people to show this. This is an interesting study from America, from Teamster, which looked at one of their databases where they had population-level data of hospitalized patients who had, from one of the insurance databases, quality of life scores, SF36 scores, at different time points. And they were sort of able to reconstruct trajectories from those data sets with a hospitalization in the middle. And they compared patients who had a hospitalization without an ICU stay and one with an ICU stay. And that's what this shows. And interestingly, they showed that at population level, there was actually no particular hit from being in ICU. It was actually very similar in terms of trajectories to just being hospitalized. But when they then broke that down by the quartile of your physical component quality of life, rather like we sort of did with comorbidities, was your baseline good versus bad, then you started to see the signal. The decrement of both a hospitalization, but particularly a critical care stay, was greatest if you were previously well. And that sort of makes sense to us, but it doesn't make such a difference if you're previously less well at population level. But if we lump all these patients in together, we're probably not going to gain QALYs. We may only be gaining QALYs by our interventions, or even from critical care, in the younger group, perhaps, at least in survivor populations. So the third thing may be that the tools we're using to measure quality of life are not fit for purpose. And again, I alluded to this yesterday, but I just want to highlight it again because it's really important. So this was this nice qualitative study that spoke to patients after ICU, empirically asked them what was important in their life, and then described that and created these 3 aspects of health: emotional, cognitive, physical status on the left, and 9 areas of life that contributed to that. And then map that on to the EQ5D, which generates QALYs, or the SF36, which you can also derive QALYs from, which health economists can use, and highlighted that lots of the aspects that patients said were important about their well-being are not captured. And this is the difference between well-being and quality of life, and why QALYs may not capture well-being. So the measure lacks granularity. It particularly doesn't capture the social aspects of quality of life and well-being. And the other really important thing is that if you haven't managed to estimate a baseline, then you don't have any change to measure against. So thinking back to those quality of life trajectory studies, if you started bad and ended up bad, you may actually feel quite happy. But if you started great and ended up a bit worse, you may have a better score than the person who started bad, but you're going to feel pretty miserable. And the QALY score, if you didn't adjust for the baseline, will tell you exactly the opposite of what actually happened. And I also put this study, which came from our group, which was a very detailed, grounded theory study interviewing patient survivors. But I just highlight one of the key findings again, is that patients said that the recovery and transitioning through survivorship after intensive care was a very individual thing. And it wasn't something that these patients felt could be imposed on them by the healthcare system. It was very individual. And QALY is not really fit for that. So the last thing may be that we don't really understand what is limiting recovery of QALYs. And one of the things that struck us in our study when we looked at it was the patient symptomatology which we gathered, in particular fatigue, which there's now an increasing literature shows goes on for months and months after critical illness, and is the dominant symptom. And what we measured was fatigue on a 0 to 10 scale, and more than half the patients were in the top half, and more than a third of patients rated their fatigue at 3 and 6 months, and sometimes 12 months, way, way out there towards the worst they could imagine. And if you're fatigued, you can't take part in recovery programs. You're just too tired. And in one of our other pre-planned sub-studies, we looked at factors that might be limiting that recovery, in particular grumbling inflammation. And we showed that many patients have inflammation 3 months after being discharged from hospital. And when we looked in our cohort about the relationship between inflammation and recovery, that strongly discriminated the group. The ones that didn't recover physically were the ones that had grumbling inflammation. And even when we did multiple linear regression to adjust for all the other things we captured, that still came through as a major predictor of failure to recover. So at the moment, we're not trying to intervene on inflammation, but maybe that's a future direction. So in summary, QALYs at face value seems really attractive following critical illness, but it really is uncertain whether it represents a true patient's preference or their values. And multiple factors, many of them non-modifiable, contribute to QALYs in many of our patients, and they're not the same for all of them. So unless the interventions have a big effect on mortality, particularly early, it's going to be really difficult to improve QALYs. And if we're trying to impact on the quality of life measure, we really have to know which subgroup and how we measure it, and perhaps challenge what the health economists are telling us we have to show to be sure that we aren't missing the point with this measure. And I'll thank you there.
Thank you, Tim, for a great talk in an area that is particularly difficult to both research, analyze, interpret, and understand. It's an excellent job that you have done. There's a time for a quick question or two if someone has a question.
Hello, how are you? What's next for you? Is it developing a better tool for quality of life?
So that's a great question. So do we just need to develop a better tool? And obviously that was a question I was asked yesterday as well, for those of you who were there. I think it'd be great to develop a better tool. And it's quite interesting. In preparation for this talk, I went away and actually started reading about what the health economists are debating about QALYs. And it is very, very controversial. It's very, very complicated as well. So one of the things I realized was that the development of a new tool just for our specialty would be, for this purpose, to lead into economic evaluations, is a life's work. In fact, it's probably several people's lives' work. So it can't really be done. I think there's a great logic in developing better measures of survivorship in terms of better tools to measure survivorship other than just quality of life tools. And I'm a bit concerned by what we now have as this core outcome measure that just says we should use these measures, because I think there's this sort of internalization that the people who've done the Delphi exercises have only been focused on what we have. So I think alternative ways of measuring survivorship and quality of life is great, but that won't easily feed into economic evaluations, because the economists still have to have some way of turning it into utilities. So we're a little bit stuck with this process, or however our healthcare system does it. But one of the things I think we may be smarter at doing is thinking, should we challenge the way economic evaluations are done for critical care? So I'm not sure that this sort of long-term cost per quality approach is going to work for us unless we save lives. So is it not better to try and work with the health economists to say that our trials should merely put all the effort into understanding what impact we've had on particularly short-term mortality, but maybe actually have we managed to achieve that with less money? So the same outcome for less money. And that's what they often call cost minimization, which is different. Because if we could do what we do and achieve the same outcomes with less money, that we probably all could see as achievable. But we're not focusing so much on that in our trials, I think, at the moment. A good example is the PROTECT study, which Deborah Cook's low molecular weight heparin study, which I think you did in Australia as well. So it was basically, it wasn't a complete no-effect trial, but no effect on the primary outcome. But the secondary analysis, which Rob Fowler published in JAMA, clearly showed that using low molecular weight heparin reduced overall hospital costs. And it was a cost-effective intervention, even though it didn't improve the clinical outcomes, because it reduced doing imaging and all sorts of things like that. So I think challenging the approach we use is what we need to do as well.
Thank you, Tim. We are just over the time, and I just want to remind you again that the gala dinner starts at 6:45 this evening in halls F and G. That would conclude this session, and thank you for attending. It's a great session.